Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. It is Friday, January 18th, 2019, and nothing is going on. Everything is normal. Please proceed as you would normally to work or school, as the case may be. And then, after, remain in your homes tonight forever after. We are under 24-hour curfew. We're in a bit of an emergency situation. And, we'll just pretend we're not. We'll do our best to keep everything normal, because that's what I understand the mainstream media would like to do, although a few of them are coming over to the idea that perhaps something might not be normal. I don't know. We watched some interesting developments yesterday. Shall we recap them? Shall we read through the stories and dissect them? I don't know. It's difficult to know where to go today. It's an odd day here at the headquarters. Of course, school's closed, although I do have to get one of my kids actually to school for a makeup test during a school closure. It's a teacher work day, so they're there. So it's not, he's just going to roam the halls and take the test on his own. But that's neither here nor there. As you may have heard yesterday, let's see. Where do we start? Should we start with the trading of letters between the Speaker of the House and the President, which apparently some in the press have opted to treat as tit for tat and coming down to Trump's level? Or do we deal with the story broken yesterday evening by BuzzFeed News, which the right-wing is only too eager to point out, also features pictures of cats? So, they're not fake cats, so I'm just saying. They don't like the fact that they're covering the cats. And we could discuss subornation of perjury, which, to be fair, Rudy Giuliani didn't ever say that there wasn't any of that either. And so, I don't know. I'm not certain why he's so interested in clearing his own name, I guess. I still haven't really figured out why he thought it was strategically useful for him to remind everybody that he never said that there was no collusion or anything like that, as though he were somehow interested in salvaging his own reputation from out of this. Well, sure, there was collusion, but I never said that there wasn't. Therefore, I don't know what. I'm not certain what we're supposed to take from this. And, there was other stories out there today, or yesterday too, a weird one. Pennsylvania Republican Tom Marino, congressman from the 12th District, decided that 2 weeks in the House minority were enough for him, and that he's resigning. I don't really know what he thought was going to happen, but he didn't get an administration job or anything. He's resigning to go, no one knows what. He's taking an unspecified private sector job, so private that you can't even know what it is. And, okay. I didn't expect that to happen quite so quickly, though I'm pleased that it has. I don't think that there's a great deal of opportunity to pick up the seat, but you never know these days with the president under threat of who knows what, impeachment, treason trial, for all we know. Ow! And who knows what else might happen. A little bit of an electrical shock there. Should have waited for a break to take off the sweatshirt that I was wearing. Wow, that'll give you a zap when you're wearing headphones. So, good morning, everybody. Let's see. We might as well. I'll leave the door open. I don't know what Armando's availability is today. I'm imagining he's got plenty to say, but he may be, in fact, wrapped up in other work. But we'll leave the door open there. Greg, of course, busy this morning, and I don't know, I should just be designating a different caller each day, probably. Anyhow, just phone in. Just pick up the phone and yell at it and see if you can connect to our Skype. Our Skype hasn't been that reliable the last couple of days anyway. And I've had some helpful suggestions about replacing it. I got to see if I can get everybody else over to these other platforms. Anyway, so let's see. We are ready to roll, I guess, except for the fact that I literally just don't know where to turn first. By the way, in addition to all of the nonsense going on already, I saw this morning Donald Trump is tweeting in an attempt to resurrect a 2014 era border extremist lie. And, I thought that was a little bit surprising. This time, repeating the now years old lie that prayer rugs are being found in the desert by ranchers along the border. And I was immediately reminded that we've been here before. And the last time, I think it was, the extremist right-wing media carrying stories of prayer rugs being found along the border, and that they were fairly certain that they were being left behind by ISIS extremists who were sneaking across the southern border to attack us. They've been waiting, 4 or 5 years now for the right time, I guess. But in fact, it turned out that what they had found was someone's abandoned soccer jersey, which, can be forgiven, of course, mixing up a shirt with a rug, and of course a completely different sort of material, different sort of design on the material. It didn't surprise a great deal of us to find out that they had made a huge mistake, but they just never admitted it. And the idea of resurrecting that, I guess they think it's timely, even though I was told, like last week, that ISIS has been wiped out and we have no further need of worrying about them. That's why we're leaving Syria. That's why we were drawing down in Afghanistan. But apparently that's not the case. I've also never gotten an adequate explanation, and maybe you have, but I haven't heard it, of why Muslim fanatics would leave their prayer rugs behind. I mean, I guess it was the idea that they were in such a hurry to commit their terrorist acts now that they were inside the United States that they had no further need of what you would think would be a very important item. They had carried it all the way from the Middle East with them, only to abandon it on a ranch somewhere. Prayer time is over. Not going to need this thing 5 times a day from now on. I'm about to commit, in 5-6 years from now, a terrorist act. Time to get rid of the rug. I don't know what that was supposed to mean, or who was supposed to believe that. But I'm trying to catch up and figure out where their heads are with a little extended breakfast into the show today. Why don't you all join me in that? I am trying to stay warm. It's a little chilly here at the headquarters. And quite honestly, between the weirdness of the story and the weirdness of stories and the weirdness of the day, I'm having difficulty getting things started here. All right, well, why don't we'll jump right into the big story and read through what BuzzFeed has for us, although I suspect a number of you have read it already. I was fine with just the headlines and discussion last night. And it has been kind of odd watching the immediate reaction of a pretty significant cross-section of my Twitter feed anyway, which is pretty, it's self-selecting, obviously. But a pretty significant portion of what I was seeing was, this is of course very serious, and this could be it. It could be the straw that breaks the camel's back, etc. And some undercurrent to all of that of kind of what I expected, which was, of course he asked Michael Cohen to lie to Congress. Of course he probably asked Don Jr. to lie to Congress. He probably asked everybody who had to testify before Congress in any of these proceedings to lie or at least shade the truth. And I think we actually, I mean, in terms of subornation of perjury as a charge, as a criminal charge, if you ever get around to indicting the president for it, I think we've already got that. But I don't know. I mean, there's some extra value to having it come from Michael Cohen, who's flipped. Although every once in a while I do ask myself, do I believe that he's done that? Do I believe that he's not working some weird angle somewhere in all this? It may be that he's working his own angle. I don't think it's almost impossible at this point for him to be working a Donald Trump angle. But it's difficult ever to come around to believing him. Anyway, this is the story that's got everyone talking, and it's supposed to. That's why they printed it BuzzFeed. Jason Leopold and Anthony Cormier are the byliners on this one. President Trump directed his attorney, Michael Cohen, to lie to Congress about the Moscow Tower project, of course. Trump received 10 personal updates from Michael Cohen. That's a large number and an intentionally chosen one. 10 updates from Michael Cohen and encouraged a planning meeting with Vladimir Putin. Perhaps you've heard of him. President Donald Trump directed his longtime attorney, Michael Cohen, to lie to Congress about negotiations to build a Trump Tower in Moscow, according to 2 federal law enforcement officials involved in an investigation of the matter. Trump also supported a plan set up by Cohen to visit Russia during the presidential campaign in order to personally meet President Vladimir Putin and jumpstart the tower negotiations. Make it happen, the sources said Trump told Cohen. Well, that's rather interesting. Of course, they did spend a great deal of time insisting that the tower, though it was once a live issue, had been off the table for a considerable period of time before Trump even won the nomination. Now, it should have been off the table for a considerable amount of time before he even decided to think about announcing a run for the presidency, but he's a very selfish and stupid person, and I can understand why he would have made that mistake. Of course, by the time, I mean, the story for the longest time was that they were plans that he abandoned at least a couple of months before his securing the nomination, and that certainly by the time he had won the nomination, no one was talking about this thing anymore, because you couldn't, because you were a serious candidate for president. I mean the President of the United States. And in case you were unclear at any point. And then, of course, we learned not that long ago that there were people willing to go on television and say that the negotiations continued almost straight up to the election day. And then word came that they may have continued even into January of 2017. And so, I'm not certain what the surprise is here, except now, I guess you've got a news organization with assets that would make it worth suing, and with an eye towards its own legal liability, finally willing to print a sourced story that says, with respect to Michael Cohen, there was this encouragement to lie to Congress, and that one of the things that needed to be covered up was that they were that Donald Trump himself was actively interested in finalizing the Moscow Tower negotiations, even as he was the named Republican candidate. And who knows for how much longer after that. And again, that makes sense, too, because he may very well have thought he was going to lose in all of this. And the prospect of making a couple $100 million on a Moscow Tower, once he had lost and was back to being a, questionable businessman, why not rake in a couple $100 million? Anyway, even as Trump told the public he had no business deals with Russia, he was trying for one, but he didn't have it in hand yet. The sources said Trump and his children, Ivanka and Donald Trump Jr., received regular detailed updates about the real estate development from Cohen, who they put in charge of the project. And again, it's not entirely news all by itself that he was doing this. I guess the newest news is for how long he continued to do it, and that he was personally instructed by Donald Trump to lie about it. Cohen pleaded guilty in November to lying about the deal in testimony and in a 2-page statement to the Senate and House Intelligence Committees. So obviously we knew he lied about it already. We just didn't know why. Although I think we all guessed why. Special counsel Robert Mueller noted that Cohen's false alarm that the project ended in January of 2016 was an attempt to minimize links between the Moscow project and an individual one, remember that designation, widely understood to be Trump, in hopes of limiting the ongoing Russia investigations. And here, once again, we learn that the late coming thesis that the collusion is the cover-up, or how did I can't remember how the astonished Benjamin Wittes put the formulation exactly, but that the obstruction. The obstruction was the collusion, or the collusion was the obstruction. Now, the two sources have told BuzzFeed News that Cohen also told the special counsel that after the election, the president personally instructed him to lie by claiming that negotiations ended months earlier than they actually did in order to obscure Trump's involvement. The special counsel's office learned about Trump's directive for Cohen to lie to Congress through interviews with multiple witnesses from the Trump organization and internal company emails. Duh. Also text messages. Oh, but what about her emails? I didn't ask about those. And a cache of other documents. Cohen then acknowledged those instructions during his interviews with that office. This revelation is not, they're very clear here, not the first evidence to suggest the president may have attempted to obstruct the FBI and special counsel investigations into, what? You know, Russia's interference in the 2016 election. I am amazed at how frequently our journalist friends have to feel like they have to remind us what this investigation is all about, or what is the full name of the person conducting the investigation. But Cohen's testimony marks a significant new frontier. It is the first known example of Trump explicitly telling a subordinate to lie directly about his own dealings with Russia. On the campaign trail, Trump vehemently denied having any business interest in Russia. But behind the scenes, he was pushing the Moscow project, which he hoped could bring his company profits in excess of $300 million. Well, I don't know whether that is based in any fact or not, but that was his hope. In all likelihood, he would have gotten a lot less, I would guess, but that's his claim, and we'll hang him with it. The two law enforcement sources said he had at least 10 face-to-face meetings with Cohen about the deal during the campaign. BuzzFeed News first reported last year that Cohen and an associate, Felix Sater, had continued working on Trump Tower Moscow through June of 2016. Sater communicated with Russian bankers, developers, and officials connected to the Kremlin. That revelation was confirmed in Mueller's filings against Cohen in court last November. Attorneys close to the administration helped Cohen prepare his testimony and draft his statement to the Senate panel, the sources said. The sources did not say who the attorneys were or whether they were part of the White House counsel's staff, and did not present evidence that the lawyers knew the statements would be false. Well, I guess technically speaking, that's worth pointing out, and it's certainly interesting that they can't figure out, or at least they wouldn't state, whether or not they were White House counsel staff. It is important eventually to figure out whether actual official resources were used in preparing Cohen for, is perjurious the word? Testimony? Okay. Anyway, an attorney for Donald F. McGahn II, full name has to be recited at least once during the article, the former White House counsel who reportedly gave about 30 hours of testimony to the special counsel, told BuzzFeed News Don McGahn had no involvement with or knowledge of Michael Cohen's testimony. Of course not, he was only the White House counsel. Nor was he aware of anyone in the White House counsel's office who did. He's really got Zero idea what's going on there in the White House or the White House counsel's office. Does the White House counsel? After Cohen pleaded guilty to lying to Congress about the matter, Mueller's team filed a memo in court saying he had offered them credible and useful information over the course of 7 interviews. The special counsel wrote that Cohen had provided details about his contacts with persons connected to the White House in 2017 and 2018 and about how he had prepared his statements to Congress. The White House did not return detailed messages. They left detailed messages asking for comment, I guess. It's an interesting way of putting it. Nor did an attorney for Donald Trump Jr. or the Trump Organization. A spokesperson for the Office of Special Counsel declined to comment. Cohen also declined comment, but the law enforcement sources familiar with his testimony to the special counsel said he had confirmed that Trump directed him to lie to Congress and also that he had provided details of his conversations about the project with the president and Ivanka and Donald Jr. How does Eric avoid all of this? Those 3 members of the Trump family have distanced themselves from the Moscow project, saying that they had little knowledge of the negotiations. Only been a family goal for a couple decades, so sure. But a picture of their deep involvement is now emerging as FBI agents and prosecutors pore over witness interviews and internal documents from Cohen and other Trump Organization officials and executives. Trump was even made aware that Cohen was speaking to Russian government officials about the deal. The lawyer at one point spoke to a Kremlin aide as he sought support for the tower. Trump also encouraged Cohen to plan a trip to Russia during the campaign. That would have been amazingly stupid. Where the candidate would meet face-to-face with Putin. BuzzFeed News has previously reported that text messages and emails show Sater, a real estate developer, convicted stock swindler, and longtime asset for U.S. government intelligence agencies, worked furiously to arrange a trip for Cohen to the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, where he was supposed to meet with top Russian bankers and government officials. Cohen told Sater that to advance the deal, Trump himself would also go to Russia after the Republican National Convention in July of 2016, which is, of course, an admission that, at the very least, he wasn't first and foremost interested in running the Republicans' campaign for the presidency, and or that he really genuinely thought that under cover of trying to meet foreign officials with whom he would be dealing when president, he was going to travel to Moscow. But P.S., while he was there, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, he was going to finalize the biggest real estate deal of his life. Interesting approach to the job, let's say. Okay. The trip to St. Petersburg never took place, not surprisingly, and the plans to build Trump Tower Moscow never came to fruition. But the negotiations occupy an important place in Mueller's investigation, as agents try to learn whether it is connected to the Kremlin's interference campaign and whom Trump associates were in contact with to close the deal. After Cohen pleaded guilty last November, Trump defended his continued involvement in the Moscow project during the election, telling reporters, "There was a good chance that I wouldn't have won, in which case I would have gotten back into the business, and why should I lose lots of opportunities?" And of course, nobody bothered to answer that question for him because, I think it's pretty obvious. You got an opportunity to run for president of the United States as the official Republican nominee. Sometimes you have to make choices between the opportunities that are presented to you. Do I do this one or do I pursue a potentially profitable business deal? If you're very, very interested in a profitable business deal, follow your heart. Go for it. Don't, commit half the country to working tirelessly to see you installed as president of the United States for the following 4 years. But, I'll take it if I win or whatever. But the point is, I really am after this thing. Why should you lose lots of opportunities? Because that's what happens over linear time. You have to choose what you're going to spend your time on and gamble accordingly. You can't just have it all. Federal agents looking into whether the Trump campaign conspired with Russia to interfere in the 2016 election also tried to clarify the roles that Ivanka and Donald Trump Jr. played in the Moscow Tower negotiations, the sources said. In his plea deal with Mueller's team, Cohen acknowledged that the conversations he had about the project with Trump exceeded the 3 short briefings he testified that he gave to the president, and that he also held more extensive discussions about it with other members of the Trump family. The sources said Cohen gave Trump's children very detailed updates, although why he would waste his time with something like that, I have no idea. I'm sure it went in one ear and out the other with those guys. Ivanka Trump was slated to manage a spa at the tower, and, she was going to be spending a lot of time underground in Moscow managing the spa, I'm sure, and personally recommended an architect. Wow. She's a heavy hitter, she is. She also instructed Cohen to speak with a Russian athlete who offered, quote, synergy on a government level, unquote, which is, shocking in its own right on a number of levels. One, the sort of, I don't know what to say, airheaded attempt at sounding like you're actually involved in something like this. And 2, the fact that you actually would think it would be a good idea to continue to be involved in something like this. And then 3, the idea that I guess the clarity of vision, let's say, to understand that Russian athletes / personalities would be connected on the legitimate businessman level and the governmental level, important enough for you to direct your so-called attorneys to have side dealings with. Okay, very interesting. Anyway, in another aspect of the deal first revealed by BuzzFeed News that later was affirmed by the special counsel's sentencing memo, this meeting with the athletes, Cohen rebuffed the athletes' proposal, which angered Ivanka Trump, according to emails reviewed by BuzzFeed News. All right. Well, we'll take a short break, let things catch up with us, continue with the story. After this, we'll be right back. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Networks Radio, and let's see, catching up with what's happening. Everybody beginning to talk about the prayer rugs again, although a lot less discussion than I had hoped so far about the fact that they have already tried this years ago, and it was widely circulated in 2014 and debunked then. Nobody seems to believe it now, but not a lot of specific discussion of the fact that this is actually an old ploy. I wonder why that is the case. All right. Continuing with BuzzFeed's story here, we're, I think, about halfway through this. A spokesperson for Ivanka Trump's attorney wrote that she was only, quote, minimally involved in the project, which is hilarious because, I believe that that's true. Quite honestly, if it was the case that she was managing a spa there and once met a Russian athlete and was like, you should talk to this Russian athlete, and I think I know an architect, that is pretty minimal involvement. But what's hilarious about it is that, of course, for the years running up to this thing exploding on their faces, they were maximizing her participation. I'm personally managing the spa there. I always just did think it was sort of funny. I guess it's par for the course for the Trump family that, while we're building a hotel and it's luxury this and luxury that, the girl wants to play. All right, manage the spa, honey. You're such a brilliant, businesswoman or whatever. That's their sexism involved. Okay, so now she says she was minimally involved in the project. Ms. Trump did not know about this proposal until after a non-binding letter of intent had been signed. Never talked to anyone outside the organization about the proposal, never visited the prospective project site, and even internally was only minimally involved, wrote Peter Mirijanian. Appears to be the name of the attorney who takes care of this thing. So she was going to be managing the spa by knowing it existed, and maybe not even that. Donald Trump Jr., meanwhile, testified to the Senate Judiciary Committee on September 7th, 2017, that he was only peripherally aware of the plan to build a tower in Moscow. Most of my knowledge has been gained since, as it relates to hearing about it over the last few weeks. The two law enforcement sources disputed this characterization and said that he and Cohen had multiple detailed conversations on this subject during the campaign. Cohen, it is said anyway, will testify publicly before the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform on February 7th. And in fact, we were much closer to the end of the story than I thought, because the little scroll bar here, I guess, is counting the many, many comments to the story as part of the story's length, because we're done. That's it. And I'm pleased to say that we're finished with that one. I think Josh Marshall has been, ranting and raving the past couple of hours from last night on, or perhaps he's just being retweeted this morning, pointing out that while the perjury angle, certainly important, it provides the nexus to an actual crime that some people, for whatever reason, believe is a necessity before they would be willing to consider impeachment. The bigger story here, the larger issue, and the one which Mueller is likely working hard to try and weave a narrative together on, but Josh is going to beat him to the punch, is that, yes, there was perjury, but it was perjury aimed at covering up the fact that Donald Trump planned to, at minimum, leverage the importance of the Republican Party in the United States as one of the two major parties, and therefore the legitimate prospect, however dim it was thought to be at the time, of his becoming president of the United States, and or leverage his powers as, and prestige as president of the United States in concluding a deal that would personally enrich him, which is bad enough, but the fact that the riches depended on negotiating with, making major concessions to, and remaining beholden to Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, in the middle of all this, is what makes this really serious. Donald Trump, I would guess, I feel like I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt here, but he's not a smart guy, and I don't think that he had necessarily in mind. I would be surprised, I guess, though I don't think it's out of the question. I would be surprised if the truth were that Donald Trump planned and wanted to have the United States take a subordinate role to Russia and take its instructions from Russia, and that he meant, in fact, to undermine the sovereignty, turn the sovereignty of the United States over to Vladimir Putin. I don't think he understands what he was doing and how close that comes to actually being the case, but I think he's the kind of guy who, caught up in a situation where he finds himself beholden to anyone, to Putin, though, in particular, because he stands to lose, some portion or all of millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars if he doesn't keep Putin happy. I don't think he sees that as being controlled or manipulated by Putin. He sees that as deal-making, as being smart, as doing what's necessary to coax out every bit of the $300 million he thought he was going to profit from this thing, even though what it requires is subordinating yourself entirely to Vladimir Putin. And in his career, such as it was as a real estate developer, a con man, a businessman, whatever you want to however you want to describe him. I guess between the fact that his business really wasn't very large and the fact that he had no other shareholders, it was not a publicly traded company, didn't have any of those obligations. The only obligations he had were to himself. It never bothered him that he really did have to prostrate himself before the powers that be involved in any of his other deals if they were, if they really held the fate of the deal in their hands. Most things, I'm sure it would have been unfamiliar to him because he always felt like he was in the driver's seat of everything, even when he was scrambling to try and stay afloat when he was bankrupt. He felt like he could be making demands on the banks. But with Putin, he seemed to know right off the bat that it would be a matter of flattering him and keeping him happy. And I guess he just thought all Putin really would want from me, as just Donald Trump private business guy, all Putin would want from me is, some gifts and flattery and occasionally maybe a bribe or two. Or he may ask me, weigh in. Do you think you would have influence with the American president on this or that? And Donald Trump would say, yeah, sure, I do. Absolutely. Not with the idea in mind that he would be working as an agent for the Russians, but with the idea in mind that he would keep Vladimir Putin happy and he would retain his Moscow deal. And he also probably would have enjoyed the prospect of approaching the president of the United States and being able to present himself as somebody who was so important that he had Vladimir Putin's confidence and he wanted to pass on an important message of international relations to him. And that a Republican president, or, I guess absent his running for president and becoming president, it's possible that in an alternative timeline, a Democratic president might also have entertained this proposal and had Donald Trump, famous guy, come to the White House and have a meeting, whereupon, he would immediately realize this guy is really incredibly stupid and doesn't know what he's talking about. But, it wouldn't matter very much. I think Trump thought that even if he were to win the presidency, he probably thought he could compartmentalize. Sure, I'll give him the bribes he wants, just to keep him happy so he doesn't screw with my business. But if he asks me to do something crazy like leave NATO or dismantle NATO or somehow trade away the strategic advantage of the United States in foreign policy or in our own defense of our homeland or whatever, or, our nuclear or missile arsenal across the world, well, I'll just say no, because that's different. You can't just mix the two of those things up. And I think he really believed that he thought he could keep those things separate if it ever came to it. Of course, there is always the possibility that he just thought, there's no such thing as government. The idea of a sovereign United States versus a sovereign Russia, who cares as long as money piles up in my bank account? There are such people as that as well. And, it's hard to tell which one it was at work here, and we can't tell from this new story, but it's just worth keeping in mind. I mean, I really, if you're trying to construct an entire overarching narrative here, I do think that he would have, or maybe did nearly, walk almost entirely blindly into outright treason. And I think that he could have been persuaded to dismantle American defenses at some point, had Putin been able to convince him that somehow the deal wouldn't go through unless he did. And I just think that Donald Trump would probably view the two things as entirely separate. It's just that no one else in the world would view it that way. And he's only now, I guess, dawning on him that he would never, I'm probably not dawning on him that he wouldn't have been able to succeed, but that nobody trusts that he would have been able to succeed. And I think it comes as a real surprise to him, and probably to Ivanka and Don Jr. too. I don't know whether that came as a surprise to Michael Cohen, but the only thing I can think of that, besides his own self-interest, and I mean, he's still probably going to do jail time, but his own self-interest in flipping, the only other narrative that fits any of this for him is it dawns on him at some point, yeah, we were never really going to be able to separate the two. It never really occurred to me how dangerous it would be to have the biggest deal in Donald Trump's history hinge on keeping Vladimir Putin happy if the person who was being asked to keep Vladimir Putin happy was the president of the United States. Because I never thought we would win, for one thing, and two, I thought we could maybe handle the thing, or the deal would be done. And I don't know whether they really thought, I mean, he knows Felix Sater. They know Russian mobsters. They know what they're dealing with. Maybe they thought Putin was somehow different because he was, quote unquote, president of the Russian Federation. But, well, one, he's mobster number one over there. And if they didn't realize it, shame on them. And two, I think it may have come to them late that you can't just ink a deal with the guy and then be like, no, we had a deal. That doesn't work for the mobster president of oligarchic Russia is not going to honor the contract. You're not going to be able to sue him into compliance with you. And I don't think that they thought about that. I mean, that was if they did, it was a more distant thought than, well, don't worry about it because we're not going to win the presidency. And, therefore it's not a problem. And then I wonder whether if at that point, when it became clear to them, I guess, at least as early as the Trump Tower meeting in June of 2016 with Natalia Veselnitskaya and others, when there was an overt mention of the the Russian government's program of assistance with the campaign in Goldstone's emails to Don Jr., it must have occurred to them, I guess at least at that point, that, well, why is Vladimir Putin so interested in having Trump win? Wouldn't Putin be in a better position to squeeze us on the Moscow Trump Tower deal and get a better bargain for himself if we were still some private citizen schmo? I mean, we were running in order to boost the brand and the brand recognition and the cachet of the Trump name. But they might have thought, Putin, their initial thought might have been Putin would, I assume, prefer that we not win so that he could get more concessions out of us. If we were to win and become president of the United States, why, we'd be his equal and he wouldn't be able to squeeze these concessions out of us, which is amazing because, of course, Putin probably realized a lot earlier than they did. No, I will be able to squeeze you even harder because you will, in fact, have reason external to yourself at last to have some fear, some shame over your dealings because you'll look horrible at having sold your country out for a couple of bucks. But I guess Putin's miscalculation perhaps was in thinking that would happen to Donald Trump. And it didn't, and it can't. So I don't know. Maybe he's surprised himself there. I don't know. This is just interesting speculation to me. That's kind of where I think he came to this situation from. That he really believed that he could keep the things separate, even if he did win, and that if he won the presidency, Putin wanted to help him win the presidency. Fine, he's an idiot. He doesn't understand how much better off I'll be being able to negotiate with him as an equal. And he really thought that he'd be able to do that without any idea that, the eyes of the world then would be on him. The eyes of America, anyway, would be on him, and thinking any deal that gets concluded is corrupt on its face. You're not allowed to do this. You can't let yourself be beholden even to the honest broker president of an honest foreign state. This would be a problem. Do you understand that? No, I don't. I don't know why that would be a problem. The business of America is business, they say. What's the big deal with my continuing to do business? I'm more American than any other president. Other presidents wanted to do this, couldn't get it done, but I was the only one able to pull it off. But that's leaving aside the fact that you're not doing business with an honest broker from an honest, legitimate sovereign country. You're doing business with the warlord of the Russian Federation. And he, can snap his fingers and put you over a barrel at any point in the biggest, most important business deal you've ever done. And if you're also president of the United States, that's bad news. That's why I guess that's where the thought came from that I've repeated a couple times on the show, that it would be a, serious badass move for Putin at this point to say, I really could have made money off of a Trump Tower deal. And it brings to mind, of course, the thought that Trump apparently had of bribing Putin to approve this deal by offering him a $50 million penthouse suite at the top of this fantastic tower, which, of course, is a number that he would have pulled out of thin air and inflated greatly to make it sound to Putin like it was worth so much more. And Putin might also be the sort of person who would be happy to believe that valuation in order to have bragging rights at what he'd been able to grift off of this thing. But he also may be smart enough to realize that he knew what Trump was doing here. But I don't know. I guess I should stop with the speculation on it down this road. I think we've probably made our point here. I guess every time I confront the thing, I'm astonished at how childish Trump's understanding of what was going on here had to have been for him to think that he could possibly get away with this. But I don't know. I guess I'm just continually astonished by the guy. Anyway, I guess at this point, we'll switch gears slightly. And there are a number of other pieces of the political puzzle, the greater political puzzle here in the United States, and the international intrigue puzzle that we can put together. Maybe in transition, I'll keep a Russia angle on this one, and bring up a piece that the headline intrigued me. I was curious what we might learn from this Casey Michael piece from Think Progress. This is something I hadn't been expecting. The latest front in Russian infiltration. Was expecting a story about that. Wasn't expecting it to be America's right-wing homeschooling movement. Although America's right-wing anything makes a good fit for these guys. But homeschooling, I was not expecting. Would you be interested in hearing about this? I am. The group and its origins, the story begins, sound innocuous enough. That's a great way of beginning in your infiltration. But the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, or HSLDA, a right-wing group founded 36 years ago, that's a pedigree in this country, has deepened connections between America's religious right and Russians, even as the latter have been sanctioned by the United States, according to a Think Progress investigation. By networking with Russians, HSLDA, now America's largest right-wing homeschooling association, and I guess they thought, I want to get some of this great NRA gravy train money. We'll talk to some Russians. Maybe a pretty disproportionate cross-section of our assets should come from Russia, they figured. So this association has provided the Kremlin with a new avenue of influence over some of the most conservative organizations in the United States. Oh no. And while investigations by Special Counsel Robert Mueller, intelligence organizations, and congressional committees have focused on Russia's efforts to influence U.S. elections, Russian ties to groups like the HSLDA demonstrate the Kremlin's broader attempts to hold sway over American policies. Other ties between sanctioned Russians and the American far right are well documented, from Christian fundamentalists to white supremacists to secession movements to fascists and the so-called alt-right, all references which are linked here in the story. The links, there's no pun intended, the links are as diffuse as they are damning. Not only have these networks brought Russian agents into close contact with higher-ups in the Republican Party, but they've presented some of the primary threads of the Kremlin's efforts at upending and unwinding American democracy. But at the same time that details and criticism of these links between Russia and American right-wing groups were emerging, HSLDA co-sponsored a formal homeschooling conference. Where? That's right, in Moscow. Oh, and St. Petersburg. Think Progress found. One of the conference's other sponsors was a foundation run by sanctioned Russian oligarch Konstantin Malofeev. That's not one that I've heard of before, but there's an endless supply. The event featured some of the most outspoken anti-LGBTQ officials in Russia and included a Russian official who's currently sanctioned by the U.S. for her role in stoking Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This global home education conference, like the trip to Moscow for the NRA folks, it seems to me, which hosted more than 1,000 attendees from over 20 countries, provided a platform for these Russian officials and their networks to work with leaders of America's homeschooling movement, all of it taking place as Russian links with the American far right continue to spill out elsewhere. Now, I have some dark visions of where this story could go. If they don't bring it there, perhaps we can do a little more fun speculation at the end. Let's see. The next section here is entitled Sanctioning Homeschoolers. It's an interesting use of the term, sanctioning. Since its founding in 1983, the Virginia-based, just like the NRA, HSLDA has become America's most prominent homeschooling organization. The group, which advocates on behalf of homeschooling families, has a right-wing religious bent, as a lot of them do. It describes its employees as, quote, Christians who seek to honor God, unquote, in their work. And I guess here, I think the Russians learned a long time ago from sheer repetition that that's the sort of thing that you would say, in your bot's Twitter profile or something like that, in order to convince, they probably thought all Americans, but it doesn't work with all Americans, that you were a genuine, American patriot. Anyway, it describes its employees as Christians who seek to honor God in their work. Its founder, Michael Farris, has described homeschooling as, quote, a way to obey God's command to teach our children to love God, end quote. Okay. HSLDA is probably the major player who's driven American homeschooling in the last 30 years, and they've always been a very far-right, religious right organization, said Catherine Brightbill, a legislative analyst with the Coalition for Responsible Home Education, different group, a nonprofit that advocates for accountability in homeschooling, which is a good idea. HSLDA has pretty much always existed, in part to create that next generation of soldiers for the religious right to train up kids to take over in politics, she said. Yes, and that's what it's all about. As it grew into the most prominent homeschooling organization in the U.S., it attracted the attention of Russians leading efforts to build relationships with the American far right. These groups and individuals would help obscure the true nature of Moscow's kleptocratic dictatorship to Americans, especially to segments of the American right. Here we go. In 2014, the Kremlin pushed these relationships further. As U.S.-Russian relations fractured following Russia's invasion of Ukraine that year, Russians close to the Kremlin looked to propel themselves directly into the types of groups and movements pushing traditional values, especially within the American religious right. One of these groups, the World Congress of Families. It's such a great name. I'm sure families all across the globe are running for membership in the World Congress of Families. Anyway, they played an outsized role linking sanctioned Russian officials to the broader U.S. religious right. The WCF, which the Southern Poverty Law Center has designated a hate group, is a joint Russian-American project that reportedly receives funding from sanctioned Russian oligarchs like Malofeev and Vladimir Yanukin, the latter of whom is the former head of Russian Railways and a close Putin confidant. The WCF took credit for helping pass a 2011 Russian law restricting abortion access, and has likewise helped build an international coalition of anti-LGBTQ forces. It boasts some 50 membership organizations who pay dues, or kick up, as they say in the mob, including the Alliance Defending Freedom and Family Research Council. You've heard of them, which are also designated hate groups by the SPLC, by the way. The WCF took credit for helping push Russia's 2013 anti-propaganda law, so-called anti-propaganda law, which effectively demonizes the entire LGBTQ community. In 2014, the WCF announced it would host its annual conference in where? In Moscow. The group's most recent conference, which Think Progress covered, was held in Moldova and featured many of the same Russian figures who joined the HSLDA in Russia last year. After the U.S. began issuing sanctions on Russia in 2014 in response to Russia's annexation of Crimea and Russian funding for separatists in Ukraine, the WCF announced it would no longer be organizing the conference, citing concerns about potentially breaching those sanctions. I'm sure they were very concerned about that, because the conference was held anyway and appeared almost identical to what the WCF had originally planned. We'll talk more about that and the other implications of the story after this break. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Just a brief break, catch the breath. As I told you before we took the break, the conference was held anyway and appeared almost identical to what the WCF had originally planned. And while some American groups like the Concerned Women for America, we keep hearing their name every once in a while, decided to skip the conference, good on them, I guess, a number of Americans showed up, including Michael Donnelly, the HSLDA's Director of Global Outreach. The HSLDA didn't publicize Donnelly's visit to Russia. Other groups like Texas secessionists, who have also traveled to Russia in recent years while refraining from posting anything publicly about their visits. But Bright Bill, with the Coalition for Responsible Home Education, discovered that Donnelly followed through on his pledge to speak at the conference. In a series of Facebook posts that Bright Bill uncovered, Donnelly wrote, I guess you don't really have to uncover somebody's Facebook post, but okay, you found it. Donnelly wrote that he, quote, met with senior leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church. As Donnelly noted on Facebook, the family conference I'm attending today is being held at the Kremlin and says a lot, at least on its face, about the value of family in Russian government. That's what it was supposed to convey to you, Donnelly, and I guess it worked pretty well. They know you guys, you are open books, I guess, to anybody who wants to observe you cynically from the outside. Why don't we offer them the Kremlin? This just stresses the importance of the family unit here in autocratic, mob-ruled Russia. Well, you know from watching The Sopranos how much they value family, and in what ways. Donnelly confirmed he attended the conference, writing in a text message that he was, quote, there on official business, so don't look any further. What were you doing there? Official business. Oh, official business, I see. Well, no further inquiry then. Donnelly's visit, Bright Bill said, was super hush-hush, and for good reason. In 2014, Americans' ties to Russia were suddenly under U.S. scrutiny. Russia had just invaded Ukraine and supplied separatists with weaponry that brought down a Malaysian Air Flight MH17, killing 298 people. We were frowning on that, Mr. Donnelly, at the time, and I guess that didn't occur to you. But for those following Russian outreach efforts to the American far right, that 2014 conference was a turning point, really. It marked a moment in which Russia took on the mantle of leadership of global social conservatism, said scholar Chris Stroop, an expert on links between Russia and the American religious right, who received a doctorate from Stanford in Russian history. Good for you. That's not super relevant, but that's, I guess, your credentials. By 2018, those ties between the HSLDA and networks of sanctioned Russians had continued and had deepened. One of the primary links between the HSLDA and the sanctioned Russian officials is Alexei Komov, a Russian national. Komov speaks fluent English and has spent the past few years as the official Russian representative to the WCF. He also works directly for Malofeev, a man nicknamed God's oligarch, for his role in financing religious right ventures in Russia and abroad. Malofeev is currently under U.S. sanctions for having helped fund separatists in eastern Ukraine. Komov helped the HSLDA bring the annual Global Home Education Conference to Russia last May, sort of like other Russians helped bring the Miss Universe pageant to Russia some years ago. That's kind of what they do. The first time the conference was hosted there, not unlike the Miss Universe pageant. The decision effectively represented the culmination of Russia's efforts to liaise with the American right-wing homeschooling movement. I suppose the gun rights movement having already been co-opted. One of the outlets that promoted the conference was a pro-Kremlin site called Russian Faith, which is run by the rabidly anti-Semitic Charles Bausman. Another WCF advisor, Pavel Parfentiev, who claimed credit for Russia's ban on adoptions by LGBTQ couples, spoke at the conference. They love using the adoption weapon. Donnelly said the 2018 conference wasn't specifically an HSLDA project, but that HSLDA was simply one of the event's co-sponsors. He also said that HSLDA provided no direct financial support for the conference. Who needs to? The oligarchs will pay for it. They're such good guys. The conference is a project supported by HSLDA, but it's not HSLDA as the organization that actually did the conference. He told Think Progress, okay, we felt that Russia was a good place to go, and it turns out it was. In other words, people were paying for everything. It was free for us, and they kept saying they loved God and that they loved what we were doing, and all they really wanted was to maybe control the curriculum that we taught America's next generation of right-wing politicians about Russia and Russian history and how Russia is our friend now. Would that be okay? Oh, yeah? All right. But anyway, it appears the HSLDA played an important role in organizing the conference. The official contact for the conference was an HSLDA email address, and the conference's official webpage was registered by the HSLDA. Komov was the primary organizer, Russian organizer, of this homeschooling event, said Alan Carlson, one of the WCF's co-founders and a speaker at the conference. The chief American sponsoring group was the HSLDA. The conference, held in St. Petersburg and Moscow, billed itself as a forum to cultivate awareness about home education, its legal framework, social and academic research, and practical experience around the world. It was, according to the official page, hugely successful, or as Carlson put it, I think it was a very significant event. And there's a quote here, I guess maybe from that webpage. It makes sense that we would find the leaders of America's what is this supposed to be? Whose page is this? Interesting. Because the quote here embedded in this is, it makes sense that we would find the leaders of America's Christofascist homeschooling movement networking with Russians with whom they share ideological affinity. And that may have been true, the story continues, in the context of homeschooling, but it was also a coup for sanctioned Russians seeking to connect with the American right. It is interesting, and I guess at this point, I would pause to work in the question that we get from our listener friend, the Warlock, who asks, does it matter that Russia is forging links with the right? And I guess my answer to him just on Twitter was, I don't know that it matters specifically that it was the right that they were seeking to make connections with, but it happened to be true. And the more I think about it, I think part of the significance here is they're talking, of course, to the part of the American political spectrum that is at that point, relatively speaking, out of power. That is to say, Barack Obama is the president, and we define being in or out of power in this country based on who holds the White House, which is probably a mistake and probably has the founders turning over in their graves, but it wouldn't have mattered at that point because they also had, I don't know about what point in history we're talking about here exactly. I guess by 2014, they also controlled both houses of Congress as well, so not a huge surprise. Anyway, you'd be able to get away with the characterization that the Republicans were out of power only if you focused entirely on the White House, as we tend to do as Americans, or at least of late. But what the reason I bring that up is because they were looking to cultivate connections with the segment of the population that was most vehemently and perhaps most insanely opposed to the administration of the current American president. And it may have been that they might have done that with any American president, with the possible exception of the person they discovered could actually just be controlled as a puppet, Donald Trump. But it was surely the case that they wanted very badly to undermine an American president who was sanctioning their top oligarchs. This was extraordinarily upsetting to them, and it cramped their style, and they couldn't make the money that they wanted and launder it in the way they wanted so long as Obama was in office. And it took about 10 seconds of looking around the American political spectrum, because we're allowed to express these things openly on the internet, which can be accessed from Russia. You don't have to send any agents to come and assess the political situation in the United States and wire their observations back to Moscow. You can tell remotely that there's a faction, a sizable faction of Americans in politics who would literally do anything to undermine Barack Obama's administration, up to and including actual treason to do it. Now, we might not have to call on them to do this, but the fact is, all we'd have to do to, A, convince them that we are on their side is speak their language. And how do you speak their language? One way to do it is be a gun fanatic. Another way to do it is be a religious fanatic. Another way to do it is be an anti-LGBTQ fanatic. That's great because we already are that. And another way they discovered homeschooling fanaticism also. Oh, and, just basic family and social conservative values. And you could do anything you wanted if you could gain their confidence with that. They would absolutely advocate for the impeachment of the American president. They would absolutely advocate for overthrowing an American president. They would absolutely advocate for telling the world that a significant number of Americans believe that the current American president was illegitimate in his exercise of any power because he wasn't even born in the United States. This was a huge opportunity to undermine the American president who stood in the way of their mobster plans for laundering money and making more of it to launder along the way. And it was a huge discovery for them that there were people who literally, to borrow from Sarah Sanders here, who hated their president more than they loved their country. That's where that notion comes from, is that Americans, 20 something, maybe 20, 21, 25 in some cases, depending on what you're asking about, percent of Americans would say outright, whether they meant it or not, whether they'd ever really given it any thought all the way through to what it actually meant, if they were being asked this question by Russians and knew that they were being asked this question by Russians for these purposes, would still say, yes, I hate the president so much, I would undermine the country to get rid of him. Because that would only help. We would be making America great again if we did that. And Russians thinking, well, what if we say stopped you short of that? If we could unseat your president, but then stop you short of making America great, wouldn't that be fantastic? And this was one of the avenues. Whether they really had any intention of dictating or helping to shape American homeschooling curricula, I have no idea. Although that would be a fantastic side benefit from it all. They were just more interested in, these were desperate people and not particularly well-educated people and angry political radicals willing to do anything to undermine a president they hated and viewed as illegitimate. It's a terrific combination for exploitation by the Russians. It doesn't make us uncomfortable ideologically here to fund your efforts. It helps us geopolitically with our sanctions problem. And you guys are all advocates of homeschooling, and typically, quite honestly, a lot of people don't do such a great job with the homeschooling, and part of the problem is that the teachers are no good. And you might actually be easy to manipulate along the way. Besides, though, we can overcome your traditional wariness of Russians by saying, one, Russia's our friend now, and two, you can tell what a great friend we are by how much we love and are willing to support your traditional American values. Russia can't be the same old communist Soviet Union type Russia if they love religion and family values and hate gay people and love homeschooling and love guns. That's the way America is. If you're like America, then you must be our friend now. And also, hey, look at how much money you have. I had no idea. That's really fantastic. It does seem a little bit weird. I am a little bit concerned about allowing you guys to pay for everything, but it is for a good cause, so I guess it'll be okay. And besides, to this point, you've never told me what to do or what to think or how to act, so how could you be trying to influence me? Oh, that will come later? Oh, it'll be more subtle, you say. Well, I'll be on the lookout for that. Returning now to our story, one of the conference's official co-sponsors, alongside the HSLDA and the far-right Alliance Defending Freedom, was Malofeev's St. Basil the Great Charitable Foundation. That is to say, it's St. Basil who's great, not the Charitable Foundation. And among the speakers, which included some of Russia's most well-known anti-LGBTQ figures like Dmitry Smirnov, not Yakov's brother, but I guess somehow distantly related, was Yelena Mizulina, a Russian official sanctioned by the U.S., what, another one? And widely credited for helping lead Moscow's lurch toward far-right social policies over the past decade. Congratulations, Yelena. As the Obama White House announced when sanctioning Mizulina in 2014, she was partly responsible for, quote, contributing to the crisis in Ukraine, unquote, alongside Russian ultranationalists like Dmitry Rogozin and Sergei Glaziev. The Trump White House, the Russian Trump White House, has continued to sanction Mizulina. I guess she's not attractive enough for Donald Trump. Donnelly told Think Progress that the HSLDA has, quote, no links with sanctioned Russian officials and oligarchs, unquote, just like Trump has no business in Russia. But in an interview with Pravoslavy, I don't know how you would, where's the emphasis there? Pravoslavy, a website focused on Russian Orthodox affairs, Donnelly specifically pointed to Mizulina, who's now in her 5th year under American sanctions, as a model partner for the HSLDA. After all, you should be a partner with her. Though she's sanctioned by the United States government, everyone knows that the United States government is Kenyan, Muslim, socialist, Hitler, Barack Obama. So it's good for America to partner with those who have been sanctioned by its government, right? I think that Russia has a bright future in the field of family education, Donnelly said. Russia has official and very influential people who support this idea. For example, Yelena Mizulina. Okay. What a great example. Everyone knows about her. Brightbill noted that Mizulina's support for homeschooling appears to be part of the broader Russian playbook, especially when it comes to building alliances with the American far-right groups. That probably plays a big part in what they were doing with Russia and how they became so easily played by Russia, since Russian officials are telling them that they are on board with this idea of homeschooling as a human right, Brightbill said. You wondered, I wondered anyway, maybe you wondered along with me, at what point, if at any point, did officials in this HSLDA say, now wait a second, why are we so interested in homeschooling movement here in the United States? And the answer is, well, we live in a legal system in which there's, compulsory education for youth and widespread availability of public schools. But we, of course, have become convinced, in some cases with good reason, that public schools are failing our kids. Overall, of course, I would disagree with the idea that they are mostly failing our kids. But that's become a popular talking point on the right, and as part of the conservative ideology that private anything can do anything better than public anything can do it. So it fits in with the ideology. But homeschool advocates have had to fight for their right not only to party, but to actually conduct homeschooling because, of course, bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. actually want to be sure that kids are getting educated. We have compulsory education for the youngsters in this country, and simply saying you'd rather do it at home isn't enough. We need to know that you're actually teaching them something and that they're going to be able to keep up with their peers and will be employable people when they get older, which, I guess is a part of the more questionable part of the pedigree of public education in America, is to prepare us for employment. But anyway, they've had to fight a domestic legal system to allow them to be able to do this homeschooling, and to get their efforts recognized as meeting the requirements of compulsory education. So, in other words, there's a government against, which they're going up all the time. And I understand the need for them to share best practices in that fight. I guess it never occurs to them that they're being asked to share best practices with people who don't face the same legal structure. And they never wondered, what interest would Russians have in learning our experiences in fighting our American legal system? I guess it's possible, and you can say there are many similarities between your system and ours. There aren't, but you could say that there were, and convince Americans that sharing best practices for how to deal with various levels of American government bureaucracy would be somehow helpful to Russians. But I just don't. I mean, there was no robust domestic homeschooling best practices network with whom they were liaising. They were just simply told, Russian officialdom supports your efforts. Well, then if Russian officialdom supports homeschooling, there would be no need for a grassroots network of Russian conservative families to fight their government for the right to do homeschooling. But somehow this was all swept under the rug, along with fully 100% all expenses paid luxurious trips to Moscow and a share of what looked like the international spotlight to them. And so, what do you know? They decided to go on these trips. Okay. So, having noted that this was a part of the broader Russian playbook, we move on with the rest of this piece here. Some of those who spoke at the conference, such as the WCF's Carlson, tried to downplay the significance of sanctioned Russian officials and oligarchs' involvement. The thing just happened, Carlson said. It makes sense that we would find the leaders of America's Christo-fascist homeschooling movement networking with Russians with whom they shared ideological affinity, even though homeschooling, like gun ownership, is uncommon in Russia. Now we learn the provenance of that quote, or that we saw part of earlier. Stroop said, using a term to refer to fundamentalist Christian ideas used in pursuit of totalitarian rule. Okay. And important context in the part of that quote that had previously been left off. And I don't think we're in the AMP version of this thing, are we? Oh, so we are. That's the problem with this. So we can't tell about the formatting, why that quote had sort of been floating there earlier. So I went ahead with it and included it in the reading of the text. It did seem a little disjointed. And the answer is I'm reading the AMP version of this story. And so it becomes impossible to understand exactly why the print format of it is laid out the way it is. Let's see if we can grab the actual Think Progress formatting, which likely makes a lot more sense. Huge problem, by the way, for AMP, and good reason for publishers of all sorts to abandon that platform. I know that's supposed to make it easier for them to serve their content, and that's essentially the most important thing for them, but it would be nice if the content was understandable. I wonder what happens. I'm curious to scroll back to that part of the story and see. Yeah, it's hard for me to even tell where that might have been in relation to, where that embedded quote was in relation to the actual Think Progress layout of this thing. All right. Well, we'll continue on with the story. Oh, there it is. And I see how that was embedded there. Yeah, no, they sort of embedded it the same way, but it's a lot clearer and easier to tell because of the font that Think Progress itself uses, that this is while it's a pull quote, it doesn't necessarily come from this section of the story. All right, so anyway, there we are with the quote and with the additional context to it. Networking with Russians with whom they share an ideological affinity, even though homeschooling, like gun ownership, the NRA connection, is uncommon in Russia. Okay, Donnelly said the HSLDA's Russian partners made the decision to host Mizulina. We didn't invite her. The locals invited her. So Donnelly disavowing her, even though he thinks that she's a huge leader in the field. It was a global event, but the locals had some control over who got to come. Gee whiz, they were only paying all your expenses for it. You'd think they would have some control over it. They wanted her there because of her support for homeschooling and because she's very influential, even though homeschooling not really popular in Russia. But Brightbill doesn't buy it. Neither do I. HSLDA has acted as a clearinghouse for all these international homeschool organizations for years. So for them to say, oh, this isn't them, they're not the ones who are involved, it's giving them distance and plausible deniability, she said. Donnelly said that it doesn't necessarily matter that Mizulina is sanctioned, so long as she continues to back homeschooling. You see? So, in other words, let's say she had been sanctioned for human trafficking. Well, she does continue to back homeschooling. Really? Is it because it gives her access to young children away from the prying eyes of a public setting like a public school? No, that's not the reason. She's just really super religious. Okay, sure, whatever. Anyway, I'm very supportive of having people who are in power in a country speaking favorably about home education, he said. Mizulina, she's on the sanctions list, but she's obviously very influential in the Russian Duma. And so if the homeschooling movement in Russia is going to survive and thrive, they need to have support from influential people. And so The U.S. may not like Yelena Mizulina as a country. That's what it says. For whatever reason. U.S. may not, as a country, like her for whatever reason. But in Russia, she's very influential, and she's very interested in and supportive of home education. So it wouldn't really matter. For instance, if it was, I don't know, let's say Louis Farrakhan, who was very supportive of home education, they would absolutely accept his help in that, even though some people think that he ought to be under sanction. Interesting to know. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption, though it's still aimed at saying thank you to all of you who are supporters of the show. We've made a lot of progress. When we first started this campaign, fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners were donating to help keep us on the air, and now that's down to about 1 in 15, but we've got a long way to go. Remember, it won't take much. Our average monthly donation is currently about $7, for which you're getting 2 hours of great news and entertainment 5 days a week. What's that, 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal. But as a wage, well, I think Democrats would be against that. But if we all put our 70 cents together, or even half of us, that'd really be something. And my kids could go to college. Now, that's not all on you, but remember, patreon.com, Patreon.com, is there to make it easy. You can find us there by searching Kagro X, or David Waldman, or Kagro in the Morning, or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right there where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your continuing support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's finish up with this interesting Think Progress story. It's a Good Friday story. We've stayed off of, in the last half of the show, some of the major news that everybody's talking about, but this is an interesting corner of the relations between the far right in America and the Russians, so far, I think, unexplored and important to keep an eye on. Anyway, no one's knocked on my door to ask why HSLDA co-sponsored an event with Mizulina, he said. Remember, we're talking about Donnelly here. Maybe they will if you start publicizing it. If you want to get me in trouble, go ahead and make that the focus of your article. Why, thank you. I believe we will. I guess they really took that to heart. Donnelly, good job. While Donnelly said he has no plans to return to Russia in the foreseeable future, Russians who have been making inroads with the American religious right appear eager to continue their work. I wonder why. Our movements have the same issues. There's no movement there, of course. But if there was, we would have the same issues, the same challenges. And as parents, we really want what's best for children. Donnelly said in a 2017 video with Komov. Would you agree that that's what's motivating Russian homeschooling? Please let me off the hook. Absolutely, Komov responded, smiling beneath falling snow. I think we have very similar issues, and we should be close together. What do you think of that? We didn't even get to the possibility, and they didn't discuss in this article, the possibility that, and I posit this on my own here. I'm not certain that anybody's alleging this to be the case, but given, for instance, what we just watched the Orange Dotard president say with respect to the history of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan and a number of other issues, really, and it's been brought to our attention again in light of recent reporting that, for instance, the president immediately after meeting without any, notes or observations whatsoever from the American side surviving the meeting, that he met with Putin in Hamburg during the G20 conference, that he is on his way home from the conference, he's immediately, or even before he's on his way home, he's immediately calling American news media outlets and telling them that they have it all wrong about Russian interference. He's just come out of a secret meeting with no records kept with the Russian president, and it happens, by the way, right after the breaking of the story of the Trump Tower meeting. And he comes out of a meeting with Putin and says, by the way, you all misunderstand and mischaracterize the idea of Russian interference in the election. Besides, I just spoke with Vladimir Putin for an extended period of time, and he didn't try to manipulate or control me in the least. And he didn't tell me that he had interfered in the election either. In fact, he said he didn't. So you have it all wrong. He immediately begins spouting the Russian lie. Now, we didn't think that much of it at the time, of course, because that should have been his line also, that there was no collusion, that there was no interference, because if there was, that undermines his legitimacy as president, and he would want to avoid that. I understand that. Although I did find it interesting that he says at that point that no, we had a discussion. He told me he didn't interfere. And by the way, what we talked about that whole time was adoptions, which, as we know, of course, now, and even then, we knew adoptions. At the time the story broke, I guess, we knew the Trump Tower story, Veselnitsky meeting story broke. We knew pretty quickly that adoptions was their code word for discussing sanctions. And it wasn't even that well hidden. This was the reason for the connection was we'll let you have adoptions back if you lift sanctions. So we imposed the ban on adoptions because of the sanctions. And we just want what's best for children, as we just heard from the Russians here in this story. But I found it interesting that immediately, right at that point, the lie that Donald Trump chooses to go with for explaining what he spent his time talking to Vladimir Putin in Hamburg about was adoptions, which also just happens to be the exact same lie that at the exact same time, at the direction of the exact same person, Donald Trump, the White House was insisting that the Trump Tower meeting was also had taken place, a year and a half earlier, but that too was about adoptions. They're always talking about adoptions, those crazy, crazy Russians. They just won't stop. They love the adoptions, even though they were the ones that imposed the ban on it and they could lift it at any time. But they just love it so much. It seemed a little foolish, and there's really no way in the world that the 2-hour discussion between the two of them was legitimately and literally about adoptions, though it could have been about the code word, or that subject for which adoptions is a code word. But one, that can't be true, and two, it is weird that it's the exact same lie that they were then floating about the old meeting in Trump Tower and what that one was about. Oh, also about adoptions. They're always on about the adoptions, these guys. Well, I tend to doubt it. Anyway, I just thought it was interesting, the timing, and given the fact that Donald Trump himself seems so easily programmed through his education, that is, his repeated contacts with Russians, he comes away believing he's been properly educated on what the Russians were and weren't up to in 2016, and were and weren't up to dating back to 1979 when they invaded Afghanistan. And they're having tremendous success re-educating this one dotardly person and reprogramming him with their curriculum. They probably would love to have the opportunity as a side benefit to educate America's upcoming next generation of conservative, ultra right-wing people who involve themselves for whatever reason in American politics and rise to the level of, from among their genuine ranks, Vice President of the United States, from among their adopted ranks, the idiot President of the United States. So the ability to reprogram an entire curriculum for a very select and loudmouthed section of American politics that will dedicate itself throughout their lifetime to the undermining of sensible democratic administration of the United States is a tremendous opportunity. And if you can make the next round of radical right-wing conservative pseudo-American patriots believe that Russia is in the right in everything it's ever done, well, more puppets for the asking in the future. Could that be part of what they're interested in? I would think so. But if nothing else, it's simply an attempt to mirror what they see as of natural interest to the American right and simply pretend that there's a significant contingent of Russians who want the same thing. Oddly, no one who, as far as I know, who has ever traveled to Moscow with the NRA or to Moscow with the HSLDA have met any, or certainly have not spent any time discussing their having met any grassroots Russians who have represented to them that there are great numbers of ordinary Russians around the country who are tremendously interested in exactly the same issues. The only people that they've discussed and been impressed enough to discuss are this weird bunch of oligarchs who also apparently are willing to stand there and say that they have the same interests, whether they do or not. And P.S., they paid for all our food and lodgings and travel, but they were terrific people. And they were oddly, I found it very interesting to find out how many Russians are really and truly not only pro-American, but pro-freedom, patriotic, USA Christian American too. Or at least we're willing to say so and pay for all of our food. I never gave that any thought. Interesting prospect. Apparently it's never occurred to them. Anyway, a couple of other stories that are worth mentioning, although I thought that was well worth, believe it or not, I really do feel like that was well worth the time that we spent on this. Let's see, but a couple other smaller bore stories. Of course, there was the trading of letters yesterday as between the president and the speaker, and one significant difference in the nature of the letters, despite the fact that apparently some in the mainstream media want to treat them as equivalent, and that was that the president's letter canceling Nancy Pelosi's CODEL, as they call it, it's a Washington term, and that's congressional delegation, trip to, well, I guess the ultimate goal was to get to visit the troops in Afghanistan, and they were making some stops along the way. I was a little bit confused by the scheduling of the trip, and I guess everybody was. And it turns out that part of the reason for the confusion of the scheduling of the trip is that's not the sort of trip that they make a big deal announcement out of, and they in fact try to keep it under wraps because there are some security concerns with taking anyone, but in particular the Speaker of the House, who is, after all, how do you want to express it? I say second in line to the presidency, third if you include the president, who is not technically in line at all, but is in fact enjoying the presidency right now. But I see people express it differently. Sometimes they say third in line to the presidency, and sometimes they say second. Anyway, taking someone like that to Afghanistan, it's a war zone. You know, for operational security purposes, you keep it under wraps. Or at least that's the story we're hearing. And the fact that Donald Trump issued his letter is being portrayed as his having spilled the beans on a highly secure operation in a way that he really shouldn't have, and that endangers Pelosi's life, the lives of everyone traveling with her, and of course the national security in general. I think that's true, although I think that's a rather expansive reading of the whole thing. But it wouldn't surprise me, for instance, to learn that, well, that's a well-known issue among normal presidents, but that this one either didn't grasp it or that he did grasp it, but they thought, well, we're going to do it anyway. And I guess he probably rationalized it by saying, well, I'm not endangering her life because I'm blocking her from going, so she won't be there with her cover blown in order for her to be threatened. So it's not really the case that I'm really and truly threatening her. But I guess there's some difference on that front. By the way, Lauren Fox from MSNBC, just saw her tweeting that a Pelosi spokesman released a statement on the Afghanistan trip saying that they had hoped to still go last night, but that the threats after details were leaked were too great. Now they will postpone the trip. I also was confused by the timing of the trip because I had heard, and maybe I misunderstood, but I had heard that they were not going to take any congressional recesses while the government was still closed. And ordinarily, CODELs are trips that you take during a recess. And this wasn't supposed to be a quick jaunt. This was supposed to last some considerable time, this trip. And I was wondering why that was going forward. I had thought that they had discussed canceling it already. Anyway, the spokesman's statement says, the United States Congress, reminding everyone, is a co-equal branch of government in our system of checks and balances. And it's important to remind everybody of that, and I'll tell you why if this spokesperson doesn't. The Congress has a constitutional responsibility to conduct oversight in the war zone, where our men and women in uniform are risking their lives every day, Hamill said. I guess that's our spokesperson here. After President Trump revoked the use of military aircraft to travel to Afghanistan, and that's a key point in differentiating as between the two letters, the delegation was prepared to fly commercially to proceed with this vital trip, to meet with our commanders and troops on the front lines. Although yesterday the line was that was suggested in Trump's letter, and B, the line on that last night was, well, I think he knows full well that there's no chance that the Speaker of the House is going to be allowed to fly commercial into Afghanistan. But I guess apparently they were thinking about it, or want people to think that they were. In the middle of the night, the State Department's Diplomatic Security Service provided an updated threat assessment detailing that the president announcing this sensitive travel had significantly increased the danger to the delegation and the troops, security, and other officials supporting the trip, continued Hamill. This morning we learned that the administration had leaked the commercial travel plans as well. Did they, or did they simply say, well, you should travel commercial? I'm not sure. In light of the grave threats caused by the president's action, the delegation has decided to postpone the trip so as not to further endanger our troops and security personnel or the other travelers on the flights. Whether here or abroad, the Speaker always thanks our troops, diplomats, and intelligence community for their heroism and service. The Speaker commends our colleagues on the delegation who personally and officially have dedicated their lives to protect and defend the American people. So this trading of letters was very interesting because I guess the biggest takeaway from all of this is, and here I don't think we're really exaggerating. You saw what happened, right? Pelosi says, we think that you should cancel or postpone the State of the Union because there is a security issue. The people who are in charge of the security for this event are furloughed while the government is closed, and you're asking them to do an awful lot of work unpaid so that you can get your chance to do your big TV speech. The president retaliates by saying, well, in that case, you can't go on your CODEL while the government is shut down because something. And he says, I'm going to ban. Essentially, he's saying he's depending on his ability as commander-in-chief of the armed forces to ground the military aircraft that the CODEL ordinarily would be using in order to get to their destination. Now, never mind that the military is, of course, funded, the military appropriations having passed, and they're not shut down, and their people are being paid. And legislative branch appropriations has been passed too, so the Congress, the members of Congress and staff who were going on this trip also likewise are not under shutdown conditions and are not foregoing paychecks. Although it was pointed out to me that, to be fair, the State Department, which isn't funded, is typically responsible for liaising on the trip and taking care of accommodations and arranging meetings, etc., while CODELs are elsewhere in country. Although I'm not certain that they necessarily supervise the meetings in Afghanistan. Those would presumably be with members of the military, though it's possible that they may have thought to meet with members of the Afghan government as well. And there maybe State Department could possibly be involved. So that is a point to consider, but I don't think it was considered in drafting Trump's letter. Instead, he was saying, and this is the important takeaway, I think, from my perspective, if you were still wondering, for instance, with all the incessant talk of, and correctly, it is correctly incessant, talk of the incessant march to authoritarianism or outright fascism here in the United States, if you've ever pondered, well, how far would Trump think he could take things? Would Donald Trump attempt to use his authority as commander-in-chief, for instance, to leverage the power of America's armed forces against his personal political enemies here in the United States? Well, now you have your answer. Now, of course, you were probably thinking about it in terms of, well, would he send the army to arrest Pelosi or shoot Chuck Schumer or take over the country in a military coup and hand all power to him? And those we don't have answers on. But make no mistake, what happened here is the commander-in-chief leveraged his ability to command the armed forces in a way that was used to punish political enemies here in the United States. It's not a tremendous punishment. I think she's going to live this one down. I think he's got a lot more to lose in not doing the State of the Union in the usual setting than she does not going to Afghanistan. But that's what happened. He said, these planes are military planes, and though they are funded, they can't fly because I'm the commander-in-chief, and I order you not to take the Speaker of the House to Afghanistan, period, because she's a political enemy of mine. That's important, and you should take note of it. That is what happened yesterday. The president said, as commander-in-chief, I order the military to do this thing to my enemy, Nancy Pelosi. Raises a question, about I don't think that there's necessarily anything illegal in itself, per se, about the order. So I'm not terribly worried about the question of whether or not members of the American military are obeying illegal orders in order to exact revenge on political enemies of Donald Trump. But the exercise of undue influence may render it improper or even possibly illegal, but it wouldn't be, I don't think it's illegal in itself per se. Anyway, I just thought that was an interesting way of looking at what happened with those letters yesterday, and you should keep that in mind because we're inching ever closer, and it's an important question to have running in the background. All right, two other stories I'll throw at you in the last 10 minutes. One that I picked up in the Hill, just important to keep an eye on with reference to Senate procedure. Everyone loves the procedure stories. Senate Republicans eye rules change to speed Trump nominees. Alexander Bolton reports for the Hill. And you might say to yourself, what would the Senate need to do to change rules to speed the processing of Trump's nominees? They already have gotten rid of the filibuster on nominees. What's the big deal? Well, they didn't get rid of the filibuster. They changed the rules for invoking cloture, which of course left the the orphan child of the filibuster, which was never mentioned in the rules, was always simply a weird negative consequence of other rules that we've constructed elsewhere. There's nothing in the Senate rules anywhere that says there is such a thing as a filibuster and here's how you do it. It's just a creation of the rules that say how long it takes to end debate. So now we have precedent from the 2013 invocation of the so-called nuclear option by Harry Reid, and then expanded on in 2017, by Mitch McConnell, in order to force Neil Gorsuch onto the court, expanding the precedent, allowing for 50 votes to invoke cloture on nominations to the Supreme Court as well. But the works were still available, let's say, to be gummed up by Democrats on one small aspect of what has become the backwards negative set of filibuster rules. And it's not a bad reform. I actually think it makes a certain amount of logical sense and had proposed it myself when Democrats had the ability to make the change. Republicans now considering making the change themselves. And, what can I do? I say, let it happen, I suppose. And, of course, we can trade barbs about who's the hypocritical one here. Everyone possibly would be changing positions, although Schumer says he opposed the nuclear option from the beginning, which I don't think was actually a smart position, but he's insisting that he took it in order to avoid the charge of hypocrisy now. We'll see how well it works. Senate Republicans, says the story, at an off-campus meeting on Thursday, they shouldn't be allowed off-campus while the government's closed, discussed making a rules change to speed the confirmation of many of President Trump's nominees after Democrats slowed the process during Trump's first 2 years in office. There was a lot of talk about the history of the Senate and appointments. It was a big topic of conversation, said Marco Rubio, who Armando loves, who attended the all-day strategy session that Senate Republicans held Thursday at Nationals Park in southeast Washington, D.C. The fate of Trump's nominees was a top concern of Senate GOP leaders heading into the meeting, and McConnell does what? McConnell talks about the historic level of obstruction by the Democrats of our nominees at the executive level and how he's had to file cloture well over 100 times, gasp, since President Trump has taken office. This is John Barrasso recounting this stuff for reporters. Of course, filing cloture 100 times is a much different prospect these days since it only takes 50 to invoke it. But what's their problem? Their actual problem here is the post-cloture 30 hours. Rubio says here there are a lot of members that would like to see the debate time post-cloture lowered from 30 hours. It was discussed at the retreat and many times before, and by me and by Democrats when it was a terrible idea. Remember that? And every month that goes by with this sort of blockade increases the number of people that are open to that, Rubio said. Cory Gardner commenting here that McConnell has been forced to file cloture on 128 of Trump's nominees, more than the last 3 presidents combined. It's a sick obstruction of the process, he said. Something should be fixed. And it really should be. I mean, there's no reason to have, no longer any basis for the original rationale of the 30 hours post-cloture. You can't effectively debate. You can't amend. The 30 hours post-cloture was designed with bills in mind, where you would have a window to amend a bill before it passes during that 30-hour post-cloture window. But since you can't amend a nomination, there's hardly any point for having it. It's just a matter of, again, how the filibuster non-rules got constructed in the negative spaces around the rules that they have, which is, all right, well, if we're going to have a rule that says you can cut off debate, cloture, that was a new invention, and the fact that you can debate things for 30 hours afterwards, well, fine. They didn't see the need for putting in, well, only on legislation into the rules because at that point, nobody filibustered nominations. Anyway, it's, it won't be the worst thing in the world if they were to change it. It would be kind of funny to see Republicans have to resort to the nuclear option twice in the space of 2 years in order to get their work done. But unfortunately, it would also mean probably filling up a significant amount of vacancies with horrible people. But it still won't fill all the vacancies because more than half of them, they've just never bothered to name anybody. And that's probably the bigger worry with respect to filling those jobs that they should be worried about. If there's sick obstruction going on, it's the Trump administration being stupid and thinking we don't actually need to have any people or not being able to find anybody to fill those positions anyway. Anyhow, I just wanted to put that one out there on the record and have it considered. And let's see, one other thing I wanted to throw at you if I still can. This tweet that I grabbed from Dave Johnson out there on Twitter, and I just wanted to read it to you. I don't know if there's, I guess there's a little bit of a story that goes along with it, but it comes from a right-wing news source that I might not be able to or want to spend time on. But Dave observing their story, that apparently, you remember the Lois Lerner situation at the IRS, the idea that they were supposedly auditing conservative groups and conservative groups only, and particularly those with Tea Party in the name, and that they weren't auditing liberal groups and how awful and lopsided that was, only it turned out not to be true because they were auditing groups on both sides. Well, the right-wing side, of course, began a lawsuit, which under the Barack Obama administration was slated to go absolutely nowhere. because they had a legitimate defense to all of this. But apparently the lawsuits hung around long enough that they dragged into the Trump administration. And the Justice Department under the Trump administration has come up with a very interesting solution to all this. They have decided that these still live suits will all be settled out of court, and that they will agree in a settlement agreement to pay off these groups. In other words, all of these groups that were unfairly and unrealistically outraged about a fake story filed suit and did so. I don't think that they knew this was going to come to fruition, but as it turns out, they could basically just sign up for a check. You know what? I was a Tea Party person. Give me a check, federal government, because I alleged that I was being sued. Now, normally the government in normal times would say, well, we don't just give away checks to anybody, even though we are political allies. But this government, no. This administration has nothing to do with that. They say, you know what? We're going to order the Justice Department to pretend that those suits were valid and that we are settling them and paying you off. A terrific windfall, a brilliant move.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Stay tuned, of course, for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy coming up next with Justice Putnam. Fox Business, he'll tell you, is terrified of Maxine Waters' power over the banking industry, and they should be. The rising tide of the teachers' strikes finally exposing the corrupt privatizing impulse behind the charter school agenda, and one day we'll probably find out there's Russian influence in that, too.